Now this model right here, the $20 model, is what I call the sucker model, because that's who buys those suckers. What's up, Lazy Dog fam? Hope all y'all are having a fantastic day. It is Thursday, March 28th here in South Georgia, and I'm way behind on my spring planting. It's too wet to plant anything today. I kind of missed my window last week, so we're waiting on things to dry out. While we're waiting, I figured it was a good time to talk about something that's been on my mind a lot lately, and that is how I think the system somewhat is designed for beginner gardeners to fail, specifically when it comes to tomato plants that you see at your local stores. So first, let me provide a little bit of context, and then we'll talk more about these jewels right here. So lately, I've been noticing a lot of people around my age getting into gardening for the first time. Now, I'm 38, I'm not that young, I'm not that old, kind of somewhere in the middle, but it seems like mid-30s is when people kind of start wanting to garden a little bit, dabble in it, and I guess it has to do with the fact they want something to do outside with their kids. Maybe they're concerned about what's in their food. Probably a lot of different reasons people start to get into it around this age. And so kind of what got me realizing that so many people around my age are trying to get into gardening is the fact that we've been getting a ton of questions from people locally, friends we have around here. Very simple questions about, growing stuff in a couple raised beds in their backyard garden. I've also been seeing a lot of posts on Facebook from people I know, stories and posts where people are, showing their first garden in their backyard and kind of how they're putting it together. Now, one of my faults on this channel is assuming that people know a lot more than they actually know. But just based on the questions we've been getting from people locally and seeing these pictures of people setting up their first garden, it tells me that a lot of these people have no idea what they're doing. They're just plunging in. And that's okay because they're just starting out. But it kind of helps me realize maybe I need to boil things down and simplify things even more sometimes. So I was having this conversation with my wife the other night, and she always tells me that I should do these basic beginner gardening courses, either in person or online, and just haven't been able to find the time to do those. Maybe one of these days. But her point was that, yeah, these people don't know what they're doing, and they need some really, really basic instructions to get started. So considering all that, it really got me thinking how the system may not be set up that well for beginner or first-time gardeners to succeed, specifically as it relates to tomato plant offerings at the local big box store. So yesterday it was pretty much raining all day. I had to go to town for something, so I stopped by the Big Blue home improvement store just to see what kind of tomato plants they had out there, what kind of varieties they had. And as I expected, most of the tomato varieties they had sitting out there were indeterminate varieties, things like Better Boy, Big Beef. Now, they had this Celebrity here labeled as determinate. If Celebrity's a determinate, my name is Bill. I've grown Celebrity before, and it's nothing like the determinates I'm used to growing. Now, they did have one actual determinate variety, I think it was called Better Bush, and then they had one heirloom variety that they call Black Prince. And so in looking at those 6 or 7 different tomato varieties on the rack outside there, I quickly realized that there's a problem here. These aren't necessarily the best varieties for a beginner or first year gardener to be growing. Maybe not even the best varieties for somebody that's been doing it for several years. Now, there's no doubt that varieties like the Celebrity here and the Big Beef here are proven varieties that gardeners across the country have been growing for many years. But they're not necessarily the best varieties for down here in South Georgia, where our tomato growing season is relatively short. So if I plant Mr. Big Beef and I plant this determinate right alongside it, I'm going to end up getting more tomatoes off this determinate plant than I will off this plant, because they're both going to be toast, say, mid to late July. This one, if it made it through the summer, would end up making more tomatoes, but down here it won't. This one will actually make more tomatoes. And another thing to consider is the size that these plants are going to get. This plant here is going to stay pretty manageable. It's going to get 4 or 5 foot tall. It's going to get big and bushy and loaded down with fruits. This plant here is going to get pretty tall. I always get tickled seeing people buy these big beef and better boy plants at the store and buying them some of those little cone-shaped cages that these are going to outgrow pretty quickly. So I feel like a lot of beginner gardeners don't realize when they buy this plant, it's going to get pretty dang big, and it's going to require a lot more effort to grow and trellis than this one here is. Another thing to consider is the disease resistant package with some of these varieties sold at the big box stores. Now, these may be resistant to a couple really common tomato diseases, but they don't have the comprehensive package that we need down here in South Georgia. So a beginner gardener might plant one of these big beef plants here, and it might get overtaken with some type of virus or disease. They think it's their fault, when in actuality it wasn't their fault. It was just that the variety they planted was not built to withstand all the pressure down here. And all those things I mentioned are reasons why you don't see commercial tomato growers around here growing big beef, celebrity, or better boy. They're growing determinants that stay smaller. They're going to produce a ton of tomatoes at one time, things that they can trellis easier, because they're not going to get their bang for their buck out of these right here, and they're going to be a lot more effort. Now, before we talk about possible solutions, if there are any, let's talk about the size of plants you see outside these big box stores. This is always something that tickles me, how much they're charging for the different sizes of plants. So yesterday when I went, you could get a 6-pack of plants, probably just a hair bit bigger than these, for $5. Or you could get a single plant like this for $5. Or you could get the Supreme model, this one right here, in a nice plastic pot with a trellis that's going to outgrow in a few days, for $20. Now this model right here, the $20 model, is what I call the sucker model, because that's who buys those, suckers. You just buying dirt if you buy that. No matter you plant that big plant, this plant, or this little plant, assuming they were all the same variety, you're going to get the same amount of tomatoes. If we plant these two side by side, assuming they were the same variety, it wouldn't take long for this plant to catch up with this plant. So don't just buy dirt. Don't go for that big plant in the big pot. All you're paying for is dirt there. You're not really getting more value. This little plant will do the same thing. So what's the solution here, or is there a solution? Well, I'm not sure there is one. One thing we have to consider here is that different levels of gardeners have different standards that they're trying to meet. And I see this in talking with people and seeing people's pictures on social media. A lot of people that are gardening for the first time are plumb tickled if they plant this and they get 3 or 4 tomatoes off of it. They're not trying to grow enough to can and fill their pantry. They're tickled with just a few tomatoes because they grew them and it's the first time they grew any tomatoes. It never fails during the spring into summer growing season. People send us pictures of these squash and cucumbers they grew, and they're way too big. They're not any good to eat anymore, but they're tickled about the size of them. They don't even understand that, oh, you let them get too big, you needed to pick those a couple days earlier. So for a lot of people, it doesn't really matter that this big beef tomato variety isn't really the best thing to plant down here in South Georgia, because as long as they get those few tomatoes off of it, they're going to feel like they were successful. They're going to feel like it was a win. They're going to feel like their $5 was well spent. Now, the obvious solution is to grow your own plants like we do. Pick varieties that you know are going to perform well in your area, given your growing season, given your disease pressure. But beginner and first time gardeners are probably not going to be trying to grow their own transplants. They're going to go out and buy a few of these, just like we did yesterday. So trying to grow your own plants is usually something that people do a couple years down the line once they get into gardening a little bit. The thing I fear is that people go and buy varieties not necessarily suited for their area, they don't perform well, and they give up before they ever get further down the line. That's what worries me a little bit with all these varieties sitting outside the big box stores around here, that people are going to grow these, they're going to get overwhelmed with them, not going to perform well, and they're just going to give up on gardening altogether. So I think probably the best solution is to recommend to people not rush into the big box stores and buying plants like this. If you have more of a specialized nursery near you with more informed workers there that can kind of give you some guidance on which varieties are going to perform best, which varieties stay short, which varieties are going to get really tall, I think that will be best. Nothing against the people that work at the big box stores, but a lot of times they're just out there watering plants. They don't really know anything about the differences between the varieties. So, if you have that option available to you, try to go to a more specialized source, somebody that's got some knowledge there that can kind of point you in the right direction, depending on what you're wanting, how big your garden is, how many plants you're wanting to grow. So don't be a sucker this spring. I get why people go and buy these beautiful looking tomato plants. This is a pretty tomato plant here, and a lot of times these just jump in people's carts or buggies. But think about what variety it is, how big it's going to get, how tough it's going to be before you go and buy a bunch of these to plant in your backyard garden. So I hope you enjoyed the video today, and let me know in the comments below if you find that the selection at your local big box store suits you, they grow well for you, or if you're better off picking your own varieties to grow. And if you don't know much about determinate versus indeterminate tomatoes, maybe you've never seen or grown a determinate tomato, watch this video right here when we're harvesting some of our determinates last year. You'll see what I'm talking about as far as just staying short, getting bushy, and putting on a lot at one time. So check that out, and we'll see you next time right here at Lazy Dog Farm.